Behind me is a 1990 Daihatsu Rocky, and it is the coolest and the best four-wheel drive you have probably never heard of. In this video, we are going over all the really cool gadgets and gizmos that make the Rocky so special, and talk about why you should probably buy one, if you can find one. The Rocky is made by a Japanese company called Daihatsu, which is one of the largest companies you probably haven't heard of, at least if you live in the US, because Daihatsu only sold cars here between 1988 and 1992. Now, believe it or not, abroad, they sell a lot of vehicles, primarily these little K cars, but last year in 2019, they sold over 1.7 million cars. And yet here in the US, they were only around for 4 years, and then they completely disappeared from our market. All right, well that's sort of true. You see, Daihatsu is still around selling these funny little trucklet things you may have seen around college campuses and farms. But the company as we know it that sells passenger cars really doesn't exist in the United States. Now, while they were here, they only sold two models. This bizarre little economy car called the Charade, and this, the four-wheel drive Rocky. Now here's the interesting thing. Today, Daihatsu is owned entirely by Toyota, a company you probably have heard of. But back in the day, they did work together, but they weren't exactly the same company. Toyota only owned about 16% of Daihatsu when the Rocky was designed. As such, the Rocky isn't some rebadged 4Runner. It isn't some rebadged RAV4. It is entirely unique to its own model, which presents some challenges. You see, being a dead brand in the US, parts availability can be a bit of an issue. There is an owners group here in America. It's about a few hundred people large, and there are a couple of guys out of Washington that run a little operation breaking old Daihatsus and selling the parts to the few hundred enthusiasts that still exist. But apart from that, you're gonna have to get parts from like Australia or Indonesia. Now, under the hood of the Daihatsu, you'll find a 1.6 liter 4-cylinder, 16 valves, pretty fancy stuff. It develops a whopping 94 horsepower and 94 pound-feet of torque. Luckily, it's shared with the Daihatsu Applause. What is up with the naming strategy of this company? But the Daihatsu Applause was never sold in the US, and this engine isn't shared with really any other cars that were sold here. So they're gonna have to get a little creative when it's time to replace the head gasket, which goes out frequently. Now, to demonstrate that the Daihatsu is a little bit slow, I'm gonna do a 0 to 60 mile per hour test, high performance testing, using a GPS performance timer in 3, 2, 1, Lord. Oh yes, first gear, 6, 20, 6,000 RPM, this engine just screams. Oh, 45 in the third, that's 50 miles an hour. That's 55 miles an hour. Just there it is. 21.68 seconds. Now, granted, I probably could have gotten that a little quicker if I had shifted like a proper drag racer, but I'm an off-roader. And anyways, that was 6,000 RPM. Luckily, the little engine will take it because it's really well engineered, and apart from the head gasket issues, which granted not that hard to fix, they will just run forever, although they'll run forever quite slowly. When this little open-top SUV was sold way back in 1990, it did have a number of competitors, some of which you've probably heard of, like the Suzuki Samurai and the Jeep Wrangler, some of which you may have forgotten about, like the Geo Tracker. But it's kind of an interesting size because it is much bigger than a Samurai. It's something like 14 inches longer. It's also smaller than a Wrangler YJ. It's something like 5 inches shorter. But it is super incredibly wide. It is over 2.5 inches wider than a Wrangler. It's something like 8 inches wider than a Samurai, and that's because when Daihatsu brought this vehicle to market, they knew that Americans were a little hesitant after recent reports of Samurais rolling over, and Bronco 2s rolling over, and CJ5s rolling over. So they determined that, yeah, it needed to be stupid wide, and as such, take a look at this factory wide body kit. Now, admittedly from the side, it does look a little bit, I'm gonna go with dopey. Like, it's just too wide and too short. It's like a perfect square. It's not really all that aggressive and off-roady and cool. It certainly isn't very low slung and sporty. It's just, yeah, kind of dopey. The good news about the Rocky, it is a proper convertible, so you can pull off the roof in a couple different phases, just like a new Bronco. So this rear panel comes off as one big unit. It takes something like 10 bolts, but if you don't want to go through that process, you can also remove just this front portion. This right here is the latch to remove the forward panel. You actually have to push in on both of these safety releases and then grab this lever and push up. But check that out, now I have a little air vent. That's a nice touch, but the whole panel should come out as well. Let's see if I can figure this one out. All right, how hard can this be? Apparently harder than I thought it might be. Does the front unhook now? It's time to consult the owner's manual. Push up the back of the panel and remove it by pulling toward the rear. That is unhelpful. Oh wait, it is helpful. Oh, this is gonna come out and it's never gonna come back, so you better enjoy this video clip. Gee whiz, it's heavy. Oh. Anyway, now look. In a simple matter of, I don't know, 30 seconds, if you actually read the owner's manual, you have a full open top here. And you can remove the rear portion if you had a little bit more patience to pull off the 10 bolts that hold it in place. So if you do want to remove the rear portion of the top, I have read it is helpful to have a couple of hands just to grab the top on both sides, and then it just pops open. Of course, it's not metal, it is like a fiberglass top. But when you pull the top off, you're left with something interesting, which is the rear glass here on the tailgate. Now the rear glass comes out as well. You've got these big knobs. You unscrew these here, you unscrew them down here at the bottom, and then you can pull out the rear glass as one giant unit, and bam, you've got a full convertible. Now I'm not going to demonstrate that to you today because while these two gentlemen up in Washington can get pretty much every part on a Rocky, they can't get the rear glass. Apparently, like, it just doesn't exist anymore. They didn't make enough of them. They're total unicorns, and I'm probably gonna break it if I try to take it off. So this is probably the most valuable part of our little Rocky. And that's saying something, because this is a whopping $4,000 rig here. So protect your rear glass, people, like you'll love it as a baby. This is the mechanism that actually holds the door in a detent. You can actually just see it there exposed, but hey, it works really well. And then on the door itself, you have a little kind of flap here with a bag, and this is for the rear washer nozzle. You'll also notice this kind of funky brace here that extends into the storage compartment, and behind that, a roll hoop. You can see it extends all the way up here, down to the other side. It also has some triangulation. This was actually kind of advanced back in the day because this allowed the rear passengers to have shoulder belts. Wrangler didn't get that until a little bit after Daihatsu, so that was forward thinking. And the rear seat folds and tumbles. So you can fold it down like that, and you can also tumble it forward. And now look at the space. It's actually really pretty usable. Like, genuinely, that's a lot of space and storage. 6,000 RPM in a second. Oh my goodness. The Daihatsu Rocky was sold around the world, and some of our friends abroad may know it better as the Daihatsu Feroza. And the Rocky was primarily designed for countries with bad roads and countries that needed a tough little ute that would get them anywhere. Now, let's look at its competitor, the Wrangler. The YJ was designed primarily for people like me in flannels, driving to college in the 1980s. Okay, granted, it was very good off-road still, but just two very different philosophies. The Daihatsu was meant to go anywhere in the jungle and get you home. The Wrangler was designed to go anywhere in the jungle and maybe have a beach party, and then maybe get towed home, let's be honest. When Daihatsu brought the Rocky to the US, they had to face a challenge that doesn't necessarily exist in rural Indonesia, the open highway. Now they could have given it a much larger engine, or they could have given it a turbocharger, but they didn't. Instead, they kept a small 1.6 liter 4-cylinder with 94 horsepower and just gave it super short gearing, which kind of gives the illusion of acceleration, but doesn't really mean you have all that much acceleration at all. And in fact, it's one of the Daihatsu's biggest issues. Cruising along the highway, that's 5th gear. There's 3,000 RPM, I am floored. 55. Okay, there's 3,000 RPM, the engine's really starting to sing. There's 60, 30, 200 RPM, still floored. 65, we're approaching 3,500 RPM, and that's 65 miles an hour. So this little car is not good on the highway because the engine is just so buzzy. It doesn't have enough power. There are a bunch of really cool gizmos and gadgets on the outside of the Rocky, starting with the headlights. First of all, they're squared off, sealed beam of course, but check out this premium feature. It's got headlight washers, like a G-Wagon. They operate by squirting high-pressure jets of water on the headlights. Unfortunately, I'm not sure these ones work on this car, which is a bummer, but I'll try them. What a bummer. You can hear the little pump try though. It's like, Rrr. It's a little interesting to me that the headlight squirters don't work in this Rocky because pretty much everything else does, and that's not much of a surprise. These Daihatsus were incredibly well made. They were super precise in their engineering, and they used really rugged materials. So for example, the interior, very blocky, very squared off. It looks like someone threw it together with Lego bricks, but you'll never see like cracked dashes on Rockies. It seems to be very rare. None of the plastics really seem to fade, and the steering wheels would survive a nuclear apocalypse. They are, I don't know what material they used to make the steering wheel, but it's incredible. You'll see them with like 200,000 miles, and they just don't wear, like at all. They always look like this, regardless of the condition. Small little door handle is plastic. It's got a manual lock, and of course, manual roll down windows. But look how tiny the lever is. It's about the size of my index finger. Now over here next to the door handle, you'll find a really sturdy grab handle, and below that, jacking instructions. You'll notice this one, it doesn't have speakers in the doors. They were aftermarket and they fell out. Don't put aftermarket speakers in your classic vehicles because they will always turn into this mess. Probably the coolest part of the Daihatsu Rocky interior are the center-mounted gauges, just like the old school Mitsubishi Pajeros. Now on this one, we've got the volt gauge here, the inclinometer, which apparently are pretty desirable, and this one has an analog clock. It originally had a digital clock, but my dad, he liked the analog one more, so he found one on eBay and plopped it in there. Now the seats in the Rocky are really good, at least by classic four-wheel drive terms. So we've owned Samurai, we've owned a ton of Wranglers, and these seats are so much better than the competition of the day. They're proper bucket seats. They really hold you in position. They're actually really pretty comfortable and nice and supportive. What isn't so awesome about the seats is that they simply don't go back far enough, so they're manually adjustable. But this driver's seat is all the way back, and it's 6 foot 1 inch tall. Like I'm pretty cramped in here, but they could go back farther because take a look. I mean, there's tons of rear seat legroom here. The driver's side is bad. The passenger side is pretty much intolerable. I mean, look at this. What is this mess? This seat is positioned all the way back. It slides like it should, but it's actually mounted ahead of the driver's seat here, and I have, this would be horrible on any kind of trip over like an hour. That person, who's non-existent, is living large. Look at all their room. The oh you know what bar, straight out of a Wrangler. It's perfectly positioned because the seat is pathetically close to the dashboard. But anyways, the good news is when you're cruising down Moab, the passenger has a great area here to grab onto and hold on. So once you squeeze yourself behind the wheel of the Rocky, you'll notice the key, which says Daihatsu on it. It's like a museum piece. Stick it in the ignition and you'll listen to one of the worst buzzers I've heard in the industry. You ready? Oh, that's especially bad. I mean, I'm used to old car buzzers, but this one is just like at that right pitch to just drill into your brain. I mean, oh. But there's one more funny thing about the ignition switch. When you turn it off, you can't pull the key out, and that's because you gotta push the secret button here, and then you can pull the key out, or you can sit there and listen to the... Golly, that's just rough. The Rocky has this really tight 5-speed manual transmission, and as an enthusiast, I love this, but as an average US consumer, I might not have back in 1990, because this was the only transmission available in the Rocky. There was no auto option, which seems pretty short-sighted for US consumers. This is your 4-wheel drive selector, so you have 2 high, 4 high, and 4-wheel drive low, and you select it using this itty-bitty little handle, really precise. So, like even a modern-day Wrangler, I'm always fighting with the thing, like just getting a 4-wheel drive. But the Rocky, just one finger, push it back into 4-wheel drive. It's missing a sticker, but once you're in 4-wheel drive, you of course have to get out and then manually lock the hubs. I'd much prefer that system over like the Wrangler YJ that had this weird vacuum disconnect thing which would fail and then you couldn't get 4-wheel drive. The nub and then the the little locker on the hub is much better. Oh my god, it's so slow. I forget how slow it is. Go in a second. Rear-ended by a BMW there. Now the Daihatsu Rocky is so much better to drive on the road than either the Samurai or the Wrangler of the same era. Independent front suspension, and it's that width that really just gives you the confidence that you can take turns and you know, you don't get that uneasy feeling. Now I know that Donut Media says the Samurai rollover debacle was blown way out of proportion, and I get that, but if you ever drive a Samurai daily, they're a little tippy. I mean, there's just no way around it. A lot of the 80s SUVs were. The Bronco 2s were tippy. The Samurais were a little tippy. CJ5s were really tippy. They were just too narrow. The Rocky is, if anything, it's too wide. Like, the turning radius is abysmal. But the ride quality is good. Even though it's a super short wheelbase, it's really smooth. It's really sorted. The steering is so much better than the Wrangler. And the manual transmission is so much better than pretty much any other new SUV. It's crisp, it's tight. So the driving experience, apart from the power, which is minimal, that's pretty good. The Rocky has a surprising number of blank panels where it looks like switches should live. There's one here, there's one here, there's another one on the right side of the steering wheel. And this confuses me because this is the top of the line SX trim, which means it's got some really fancy features. No, not too many fancy features, but it does have like this hilarious switch here for the rear wiper. It also looks like it's prehistoric. For some reason, every switch in the Rocky looks brand new except for this one, which looks like it's been in the Titanic for 1,000 years. But on the left side of the dashboard, you'll notice a couple little slots here for coins, a little itty bitty air vent, another itty bitty air vent above said itty bitty air vent, and this, a rear defrost. We are talking luxury here, people. A rear wiper and a rear defroster. How cool is that? These are probably the most no-nonsense gauges in the industry. You've got a speedometer, a tachometer, you've got fuel, you also have temperature, and then over there you have voltage. That's nice. And then you have a number of dummy lights which illuminate here in the bottom. Are you ready? There you go, including check engine, even though this predates OBD2. In the middle of the Rocky, there's no center armrest, but there are a number of weird things and kind of funny gizmos. Now, first of all, you have the useless cubby, which is perfect for holding one My Panera card, and that's pretty much all I can find a use for that for. Behind that, you've got a little lever here. This is for the fuel flap. Whoa, apparently that's not secured very well, so I gotta fix that. That opens up your fuel door. Behind that, you have more coin storage. What is up? So you've got coin storage on the left, coin storage in the middle, and coin storage for the passenger. Behind that, you have a deeper useless cubby. And then you've got my favorite feature, which is the back door unlock. So the driver and the passenger door are manual locks, but the rear tailgate, oh, listen to that. I can unlock and lock it electrically. This is a much improved feature over both the Samurai and the Wrangler. That is luxury right there. And then of course, you got your handbrake, which works because it's a Daihatsu and everything works. Well, there you have it, the Daihatsu Rocky. It's a really cool, really well-made little four-wheel drive. It's a little bit too slow for modern use if you're gonna be driving on the highway with any kind of, regularity, but Yeah, it's pretty cool, and you can pick them up for like $3 or $4 grand if you can find them. And then if you do find them, check out Daihatsu Rocky Parts Northwest. They're not a sponsor, but they're the only saviors for us Rocky owners in America. Well, as always, this is Tommy with the Fastlane Car. Check out TFLcar.com for the latest and greatest in new and used car reviews, because we got more Rocky stuff coming. We're gonna properly take it off-road and see how she does.